So I'm giving a talk on event-based vision for Egomotion estimation. Is everything all right? Can you? Yeah, okay. Let me just fix one thing. Yeah. And let me start with shortly introducing my lab and the kind of research that we do. So the group is called Bioinspired Circuit and Systems, and our core research is fundamental research. As already Friedman mentioned, we are really trying to understand how the brain works, and we do that by emulating a neural function in hardware. So we do full custom CMOS system, and these systems are kind of special because the transistor is operated in a special regime called subthreshold analog. And we also use a special kind of digital electronics, which is asynchronous digital. And then in the last about 10 years, we have been also looking at integrating memoristic devices on top of CMOS. But you might know that this kind of approach is quite expensive, both in time and money. So building full custom CMOS system is not, does not allow us to quickly investigate new ideas. So we use tools that are made of conventional computing systems, so digital processors, for fast prototyping of our ideas. And you have examples here like the Spinnaker and the Intel system. So that's what we refer to as simulation of neural network as opposed to emulation. And if you want, it's a more conservative approach and it requires less resources. So as already mentioned, we apply these things to two streams of research. One is what we call system and theories for brain-inspired computation, and the other one is what we call sensing and actuation. And so the topic learning would be in the first stream of research, but today I'm going to focus on the second one. And by focusing on the second one, I want to first bring your attention to our senses and to the fact that whatever sense you think about, it's quite easy to understand that information about what we are sensing is carried out also in the spatial temporal signature of the signal that are being sensed. So looking at this, we came up with a computational element that is really encoding spatial temporal computational features as close as possible to a sensor, whatever sensor that might be. And this computational element, we call it time difference encoder. So this is a block diagram that I will use to explain you how the time difference encoder works. So imagine that you have two input channels. They're represented by these two horizontal lines, and they are spiking channels. They could be output of a cochlea. They could be output of a retina. And now, if there is a spike in this first channel, which we call facilitatory, we put a value on a variable. So that's what you see here. And this variable is going to then decay over time. In this example, you have a linear decay, but often we use an exponential decay. And so what happens is that if there is then an event in the second channel, we sample the value of that variable at that specific time, and we use that value as a gain for the current of a synapse. So we have a synapse that is generating a biologically realistic excited to postsynaptic current, and the amplitude of this current is modulated by this value. So then the current is integrated by a soma, and the soma will produce spikes. And so here you have an example of what happens in different situations in terms of where the two spikes are. So this is first of all a directional element. If the spike on the second channel, which we call trigger, comes before the facilitatory spike, nothing will happen, because at this time is when we sample the value of this variable, but at that time the variable will be 0. So there is no current generated by the synapse, and the postsynaptic neuron doesn't generate any spikes. But if we have the right order, so the facilitatory first and then the trigger, the value of the variable that will be sampled will be high enough such that we have a high amplitude of the current, and this high amplitude of the current will generate a burst of spikes. And now, of course, the number of spikes into this burst will depend on the time difference between the two events. So the longer the time difference, the less spikes you will get because the current will be smaller. We have implemented this computational element on different platforms, both hardware and software, and you see there an incomplete list of the platforms which this computational element is already available. And today I'm gonna focus on sight, even though we have already applied with good results this computational element to olfaction, audition, and touch, as well as sight itself. So first of all, I'm going to give you a short summary of the work done by a former PhD student in my lab, Torben Schope, just to highlight the result. And this work, of course, relies on this computational element. And then I will invite you to look at the paper in case you're interested to know more. And then I will move to another topic, which is tightly related to this one. And this will be the work of a PhD student currently in my group, Hugh Greatorex. And the rest of the talk will focus on his work. So first, what I want to tell you is that by using this time difference encoder, we were able to implement a robotic platform that is able to navigate autonomously while avoiding obstacles, and it's spiking end-to-end from the sensor to the motor commands. And as I said, I'm not going to go in the details of this, but just to give you an impression of the kind of experiments that then we are able to do with this platform, and to tell you that this is really about understanding the brain, because we took inspiration from how insects avoid obstacles, and we put our current understanding of what they do into a model. And then we experimented with the model in different tasks. And this is an example of a task in which the robot is asked to navigate into an arena that has this very weird shape. So it looks like a tunnel, but the width of the tunnel is getting smaller and smaller. And in this particular experiment, we wanted to show the effect of lateral inhibition in our model. And so we were showing that by modulating the strength of lateral inhibition, which is represented by the color of these three trajectories of the robot, we were able to modulate risk-taking behaviors. So you can imagine that going through a narrow corridor becomes more and more dangerous for the animal, especially when the size of the corridor becomes comparable with the body size. But you might want to be able to modulate the motivation to go into this risk. For example, in case the animal is looking for food and it can smell a source of food at the end of the corridor. So as I said, I'm not explaining everything, but I would like to highlight the conclusion that we could carry from this work. So we showed that a complex system with animal-like behavior can emerge by combining local neural units in a bio-inspired architecture, as I said, inspired by insect. So we perform obstacle avoidance with about 4,000 neurons and 400,000 synapses, so a system that is approachable in size. We implemented this architecture in a distributed, parallel, and asynchronous neural system, robustly performing biological relevant tasks in closed-loop experiment, as I said, end-to-end spiking and neuromorphic from the sensing to the motor commands. The most interesting part to me of this result is that we tuned hyperparameters of the model once to achieve behavior of the local neural units, which in this case was a winner-take-all network. So we tuned the winner-take-all network to identify the region of space in the visual field of the robot that was safer to drive to. So that's the only thing we embedded into the model. Nevertheless, the behavior emerged such that different tasks could be performed in a variety of environments, with the same single set of parameters. So we believe that this kind of research can lead to reasonable hypotheses and prediction that can be validated with neuroscience experiments. So we claim that this kind of research can really do what we are trying to do with research in my group. So to go from neural inspiration to artificial system and back again by making hypotheses about how the biological system is working. So I told you we do CMOS, I told you we implemented the TDE on different platforms, and now I have a few slides just to show you in concrete that we are able to put this computational element on a CMOS circuit. And I'm not going to go into the detail of the circuit unless there is a question for later on. This is just to show that we have been working already on different versions of the circuit. So this was our first version and this was our second version. And both of them were implemented in CMOS, and this is a photograph of the chip. So people in the CMOS field, when they present results, it's very important that they show a photograph of the silicon to prove that it has been built. And we already did some investigation of the behavior of the circuit, and one important outcome was, for example, that device mismatch, which is a problem that is affecting some neuromorphic systems, was strongly reduced by this new implementation. And then we could also use the chip to do the kind of experiment I showed you before, while before it was a simulation. So now you see a similar scenario where you have two input spikes on two different channels. So here the two spikes, you don't see it very well because they are superimposed. So one is black and one is orange. In the second example, you see them better. So when they're very close in time, they generate a lot of current, and then you see here in blue the postsynaptic membrane potential, and in black the output spikes of the time difference encoder. And again, you see that if you increase the time difference between the two events, the TDE will give you less and less spikes. And then you can characterize this behavior by making measurements for many different delta t on the x-axis of these two plots. And you can either count the spikes in the output burst, or you can look at the time to first spike, and you can see that the delta t is encoded also there. So, sorry. Moving forward, the work done on obstacle avoidance, we further use what was used there, which I didn't talk much about, but it was motion flow. So, and we moved on to use now motion flow for Egomotion estimation. So you might already be aware of the fact that Egomotion and motion flow are very well related. So motion flow is the motion you perceive in your visual field when you are, for example, driving a car. And so objects that are close to the street will move in your visual field over time just because of your Egomotion. And so you can imagine that it is possible to use this Egomotion to evaluate your own movements, because of course the faster you're going to move, the more intense the motion flow will be. And the TDE can exactly estimate motion flow when it is connected to an event-based camera. So an event-based camera is simply represented here. Most of you might be aware of what it is, but as a simple explanation, every pixel is gonna generate a spike or several spikes whenever it sees a change in intensity over time. So an object that is gonna move in the visual field of an event-based camera is gonna generate, in this example, a spike in the black pixel, then a spike in the gray pixel here, and then a spike in the orange pixel. Now, if you connect the TDE with the facilitatory and trigger input to these two pixels, you're gonna have a measure of motion flow, because if motion flow is very fast, you're gonna have a lot of spikes coming out of the TDE connected to these 2 pixels, because the time of flight between the 2 pixels will be very short. So we have applied this concept to a data set, the MVSEC dataset, that was created by mounting an event-based camera on a car, and provides different data with not only the events from the camera, but also IMU data, so inertial measurement unit data, and ground truth in terms of the position of the car. So because in the chip, we only have one circuit because it was a test chip, and that's normal. When you test new ideas, you first do one chip and then you later move on to, you first test one circuit in the chip and later you move on to a chip with an array of them. We had very limited resources to show the performance in silicon. So we decided to extremely downsample the visual field, and that's what you see in this figure. We selected 2 squares. So this blue square and this red square, and in each square, we didn't fill everything, but we randomly placed TDE, either looking for motion right to left or left to right, which is what you want to look at if you want to figure out how much the car is turning, because you get this kind of motion. And so in both squares, we have all these TDEs. And for each TDE, we have the events coming out of the event-based camera. So we provide these events to the circuit on the chip. And this is the outcome of this experiment here, which is, as I said, very time consuming, because for each pair of pixels connected to a TDE, we have to run one experiment and then another one. Ideally, when you will have a chip with an array of those, everything will run in parallel. So here you see the blue data from the blue and the red square. You see the spikes. So this is a raster plot in which on the x-axis you have time, and on the y-axis you have the pixel coordinates. And then here you see the mean activation, so the count of spike in a short window of time. And then here you see the same kind of plot for the right to left TDEs and from the left to right TDEs, and the same thing for the orange square that was on the right. And so now what we are saying is that if the car is going straight, I would expect that I have the same amount of motion in both directions. So if I subtract the right to left activity from the left to right, I should have a measure of how much the car is turning. And that's what we did. So that's what you see in this plot here, where on the x-axis you have time, and on the y-axis you have the change in angle. And we have several signals plotted here. One is the IMU, one is the ground truth, the blue one is simulation, and the orange one is the data from the chip. So as you see, we get quite a decent estimate of how the change in the angle are happening over time. And here you also see what happens with the estimation of the angle itself. So IMU, as it is well known, suffer from drift, and so they accumulate error over time. And that's what you see here. So the ground truth is black and the IMU is gray. And our algorithm is finding something that is better than IMU, but is not as perfect as ground truth, but it shows a very nice complement to the IMU itself. And here we just show, because we do the silicon also because it can achieve to very low power. We also show the amount of power using on the silicon to implement this Egomotion estimation from this kind of data set. So now the first results were very limited, and they were limited from what I told you, the fact that we only have one circuit in the current chip. So we wanted to demonstrate our algorithm in a full-scale solution with the same data set. So you might recognize that this piece of data here is the same that we looked at before. So if you look at this one, is the same one. So of course, again, because of the time-consuming nature of the previous experiment, we also didn't look at the whole sequence provided in the data set. But now you can see in the scaled-up system where we have a network simulation, and we can have many more TDEs looking at motion flow on the whole visual field. And then you can see how then a scaled up version of our model performs. And you can see that there are drives that carry different level of complexity in terms of estimating Egomotion. So the one we looked at before was an outdoor drive during the day, while the others are all during the night. And there is one that is particularly difficult because the car is not rotating much. So there is a lot of noise. And you can see that in this case, our algorithm does as bad as the IMU, while in all other cases, we do better than the IMU. So now, if I had a physical audience, I would, I would ask you if you have any doubt of what I've been selling you so far. Maybe I can get the Q&A and have a look, but maybe that's also too much multitasking. So maybe you can try to throw something in there. There is something that I've hidden from you, and you should definitely complain about. There is some problem with everything I presented so far about the algorithm. It's a fundamental problem. Any idea?
I have no idea. What are you hiding from us?
Sorry, what did you say?
Maybe in the chat. Let's see in the chat where there's some activity. I can do the multitasking for you. Does anyone have an idea?
And meanwhile, my presenter almost crashed, so I need anyway to go back to that page so we can take the time for that. So I give you a hint. I told you that I'm counting spikes. So I'm counting spikes. That's what I was showing you here. I count spikes here, I count spike there, and then I subtract spikes. And then later on, I told you, okay, this is my estimate of the angle derivative, and this is my estimate of the angle itself. So the question is, how do I transform number of spikes into an angle? I have no idea. And not only that, so I mean, the answer is I apply a normalization factor. So I scale it and I match it to the derivative of the angle. But it would be very hard to find one normalization factor that would work everywhere in all conditions. So, I mean, first of all, yes, we are using information from the IMU to provide this estimate, which is not bad, because I think an important purpose of this algorithm could be to complement IMU, not to replace it. But secondly, chat disable, bug or feature. Secondly, it's not compatible with an online solution. Of course, you would like this algorithm to work online. And in this data that I'm presenting now, what we did is we look at the whole data of one run, and we identified a normalization factor that would work for that sequence. So luckily, we also have a follow-up of this, and we were able to then replace this scaling factor with something that can be updated online. And this is what you see here. So now the scaling factor, it is using current information of IMU, and it is using recent information of optic flow. And it will quickly adapt in case, for example, there is a sudden change in overall activity, which results in a sudden change in the difference of the two. So what you see here is that now the approach not only is able, as before, to do better than IMU, which is not a secret by now because we're using IMU, in the simple cases, but of course we get the advantage that in the very difficult cases, we do very well, even though IMU would do really badly. So we have compared this solution to the state of the art. So we have looked at algorithms that use the same data sets so that we could compare. And the first two lines are from our work. So the first one is with the fixed scaling, and the second one is with the online scaling. So the quantity that we are comparing is, of course, an error, the average relative rotational error in this case. And on the last three columns, you can see that the feature of our algorithm are completely orthogonal to the others. So the first one, E means event by event. So we are the only one that are using the data from the event-based sensor event by event, instead of doing what is unfortunately very typical, which is collect all the data into frames. And of course, by doing that, you immediately lose the advantage of event-based cameras, and you go back to having a latency that is imposed by your frame rate. All other models rely on learning. Ours doesn't, which in this case, I would say is an advantage. So you don't need any data. You can plug your system and have it working without requiring data sets and without requiring learning. And of course, the other big difference is that we do complement IMU instead of replacing it. So this is the only algorithm in the table that uses IMU within the algorithm. So what I showed you so far was, if you want, very simple receptive fields. We add these two squares in the first example with TDs going in one direction or the other, but it doesn't generalize. We might want to have an autonomous agent that flies instead of driving, and we want to be able to track the position of this agent in 3D. And so again, we take inspiration from biology and we ask ourselves, okay, how does a fruit fly deal with this problem? And again, motion flow is clearly used there. And now you can think about more complex pattern of motion flow. And here you have the example of what would be the pattern of motion flow in response to a rotation along this axis here. So you have now a bit more complex receptive field, and this is something that we call match filter. So it's a filter that is matched to the motion that you would, motion flow that you would perceive given an elementary kind of movement, in this case, rotation. And so you can do the same reasoning also because when you look at biology, and you know that there are T4, T5 neurons in the insect brain that are responsible for encoding motion flow. And then there are other neurons in the brain that are able to sample the activity of many of those neurons. So it does make sense, and it has been proposed that the insect have match filters that are supported by this neural substrate to be able to measure different kind of elementary ego motion. And so we moved on with this concept, but again, you need two different things so that you can subtract them. So we have examples here of forward and backward motion, but of course also rotation, clockwise and anti-clockwise. And so you can then apply the same principles, have two filters, in this case, in this example for rotation, and then subtract the sum count of spikes coming out of the two filters and end up having an ego motion signal for that particular elementary motion. And this turned out to be particularly interesting for a company called Boskalis, a company in the Netherlands that does a lot of underwater investigation and monitoring, because they deal with underwater big infrastructure. And so we have done a proof of principle with them, because they have remotely operated vehicles that are very expensive and have to be driven in the sea quite deep, and there are very expert drivers that sit outside the vehicle, and they have to drive it somewhere, do some task, and then bring it back. And what you see in the image there is what they see. And so they don't get much information about where they are. So as soon as they start moving, it's really difficult for them to keep track of where they are. And as you can expect, it's crucial that they bring this very expensive machine back. So they are really interested in whatever could support their very difficult task. And so we have looked at, could we apply this algorithm to their problem? So in this case, we did a match filter of these two kind. And this is the data that we get. I said is a proof of principle because still we couldn't do this with event-based camera data. So we use the V2E to convert a normal video to event-based data. And that's why I call it a proof of principle, but we're working towards doing then the same experiment directly with event-based cameras. And so we have preliminary results also because they don't have ground truth in this data. So we can only compare with IMU, but we know that IMU is not perfect. But anyway, we could already show that in this case, we can track the movement, in this case already in 2D. So the first example was 1D and now it's in 2D. And you see that, of course, we have some errors, but yeah, we don't know what ground truth is, so it doesn't even make sense to quantify the error in this case. Okay, this is all I wanted to tell you. So I'm going to summarize what we have seen so far. So first I presented you the time difference encoder. I briefly told you that we put it in a closed loop system and we did obstacle avoidance based on motion flow. And then I showed you that this can be implemented in CMOS, which gives a lot of advantages that maybe we can discuss in the Q&A. I showed you that with this approach, we were able to get very good performance on an ego motion estimation task based on an available data set, which also gave us the opportunity to compare to other algorithms. And I showed you that we extended this work to more complex motion primitives. Therefore, we're now able to apply it to motion in 3D. As I said, the work about the robot was work by Torben Schoppe, a former PhD of my group, and other collaborators listed here. Here you can see the list of people currently in my group and the name of Hugh Greatorex, who I already mentioned before, because he's the main contributor of the topic of this talk. And of course, I would like to thank the funding agencies and you for your attention. And we're writing, so if you like this kind of research, get in touch with me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So what should people who want to apply do?
Sorry?
What should people do who want to apply for a PhD or postdoc with you?
I couldn't understand. I'm sorry. I don't know if
Can somebody else understand me?
maybe, yeah, I think it's me. Let me bring the audio a bit up. Yeah, sorry.
So I was just saying, what should people do who want to apply with you for a PhD or postdoc?
You should send me an email.
Okay, so send Elisabetta an email. Okay, so we have a bunch of questions, so very cool. The first question I can maybe answer for you. The first question is, are these underwater vehicles robotic lobsters? And of course they are, is what I would answer. But now maybe moving on to the slightly more serious questions. Here we had a technical question by Nicolangelo. How did you produce the CMOS circuit? Which foundry and process did you use, etc.?
XFAB 180 nanometers. And we often use obsolete technology because we have a lot of advantages, including lower cost. And we don't need our circuits to be very fast. In fact, as you have seen, there is this variable with the decay, which we have to implement as charge on a capacitor. But we're also investigating the possibility of implementing it with a memristor. But anyway, when you implement it as a charge on a capacitor and you want to implement reasonable time constants in the order of milliseconds, but sometimes even seconds when we apply to olfaction, it's not really convenient to go to smaller nodes because you're going to have anyway huge capacitors. But yeah, I would know what the interest of the person was in this question, so I said a few relevant things, but
well, yeah, it sounds already pretty good. And otherwise, they can also write you an email, I suggest. Excellent. So then Thomas Nowotny would like to know a little bit more about your Egomotion estimate experiments. Specifically asks whether there is any confounding motion of objects in the environment and how this would affect the estimates.
Yeah, hi Thomas. This is of course a very good question. I wouldn't know the details of that particular data set, but I would imagine that it would be difficult for them to control that there were no pedestrian movings or motorbikes passing by and other cars. So I would imagine that there were moving objects. But you're absolutely right in asking this question because all the principles that we use start from the assumption that things are not moving. And so we have never looked into detail in quantifying or analyzing what happens with moving objects. But as I said, I don't expect that in that data sets there are no moving objects. So what we rely a lot on these algorithms is the fact that we do this difference. And that cancel out a lot of things that could create problem. And of course, it's not going to be perfect, and it can be affected by different things, but we have to characterize things further.
Very good. Thanks. So then an anonymous attendee asks, thanks a lot for this talk. Could you please tell me a bit more about what software and robots you used? Is it an own robot? And have you tried different models? And what were your experiences?
So this is then about the first work.
Yeah, I imagine.
The robot was equipped with a spinnaker system. So the brain of the robot was a simulation on the spinnaker system. And
And this little robot in the picture, what is it? I guess that maybe
it's
might
something
also.
that we built. Yeah, it's nothing special. It's just a tool for us. So we built it with off-the-shelf components. So it's nothing special. But it has a DVS camera, a neuromorphic system, and we also use FPGAs for motor control.
And you say this casually, nothing special. You know, for me as a theorist, this looks like almost like Terminator already. It's very impressive. And I would never be able to build such a thing. But I hope that answers the question. Then we have time maybe for one or two more. So neuromorphism asks, is that Egomotion calculated for a single DVS, or the system had two DVS like a human and the eyes? This might be crucial to the perception of outside movement while the Egomotion is happening. The spikes happening on the fringes of the DVS in the forward movement might be ignored. But for example, a dog running into the street would be detected as movement much easier. So there was a lot in this question, but I think the question is really, first of all, are there one or two? And then it would maybe help a little bit with Thomas' question for I'm inferring in.
Maybe we can start from this one, and this one, as you can see, has only one.
Yeah.
So you're right, you can do more complex things with two, but you can already do a lot with one. And our algorithm is really looking at pairs of pixels and doing Egomotion estimation on these two pairs. And that part you don't necessarily need to connect it to another DVS, but and you can also, yeah, I mean you can use two for doing depth perception, for example. And there is a lot of work on that, also inspired by biology, for example. Work from Giacomo Indiveri's lab, like Nicoletta Risi's PhD thesis and other things. But what we did here, the concept itself doesn't rely in any way in having two cameras. But I would imagine that you could expand it and get more out of it by using two.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So then here's another question by Sohail Siadat. That's a technical one as far as I can tell. So for your test circuits, how did you shorten the cycles? I think they mean the tape out manufacturing cycle. Did you manually build CMOS circuits instead of foundries, or did you send those designs to foundries? They have a long process.
And that relates to the previous question. We did fabricate the chip. That's why the picture was there. So we are part of Europractice, which is a consortium of foundries that gives access to academia for lower prices than the commercial ones. So this is really the silicon that came back from the foundry. So as I said, yeah.
And there's a follow-up part to the question, is whether you could have also done this with an FPGA or FPGA-like.
Yes, and we have done it. So we do have an FPGA implementation of the TDE.
But of course, this is much cooler if you have your own chip and probably much more efficient in the end. But so exactly. I hope this answers Sohail's questions then.
Yeah, so in the long run, so we don't have a system on the chip yet. It was only the circuit. But in the long run, if you're able to do a system all in full CMOS with this kind of circuits, you are for sure going to be order of magnitudes more efficient. So that would be one reason to do it with the CMOS. Do the master filter the 2 pixel record, right? So the TD itself connected to 2 pixel is related to the Reichardt detector. So
okay, you're already on Laurent's questions. Very good. Okay.
Yeah, so I've seen Laurent's question. It's very relevant. Hi, Laurent. So at the beginning, when we attached this TDE to 2 pixel, we called it spiking elementary motion detector, and it's very much a spiking implementation of the Reichardt detector.
Okay, great. So thanks for answering the question. Just so everybody knows which question was answered, so this is Laurent Perinet asking, do the matched filters generalize the 2 pixel Reichardt detector? And
Thanks,
you just had
Friedman.
the answer.
Sorry for jumping on it without reading it.
No worries at all. Okay, very cool. Right. So I'm just checking whether our next speaker is has already joined, because they just wrote to us that they have problems with power. Because the next speaker is from India, and there's a thunderstorm at the moment, and the power is sometimes going off. So I think we have time for one or two more questions while Dan is working out the back end. So here's one which I'm not sure I understand, but maybe you do. So Fardin of Dide asks, how about training a regressor model in estimating the normalization factor to convert spike counts to angles, then using techniques such as domain adaptation and more generalized spike count angle models can be established, guaranteeing cross-task and domain generalizations.
So I think in these kind of systems, avoiding learning is helpful. Maybe this is an arguable opinion, and we could have a discussion about that. But the fact that we are able to online adapt our normalization factor, I think is just as good as what you need. And I wouldn't see good reason to go into the complication that was described in the question. But that could be a longer conversation, I expect, especially with back and forth and not with this kind of setting. But that would be my first reaction to that. Maybe if I could pick one, Friedman, can I?
Absolutely. Just let me know which one, and maybe let's read it out to everybody.
One. This time I'll behave better and I'll read it. Wouldn't this way to detect Egomotion be sensitive for differences in detail level on each side of the road? So this is a very good question, and this relates to the fact that I was like, yeah, this is not perfect, but in fact we are not. So in the example with the two squares, is not that we are subtracting activity from one square to the other. For each square, we have right, left everywhere, right, left, and left, right everywhere, and then we are subtracting within that square. So yes, there could be problems in principle with different level of activity, but if you uniformly distribute your TDs, you're going to have in a region with a lot of activity, both the one from left to right and the one from right to left. So we really trust the difference, and it works quite well so far. And of course, we have to investigate more. I presented a lot of results that are not published yet. So there is still some work to be done, but the fact that we do the difference is really the advantage. And you are right, if we would do the difference from something here and something there, we would have some problem. But we do difference of right, left, and left, right in the same location.